For me in music, what do I think about AI when it comes to my position as a violinist, as a classically trained violinist, and as a composer of electronic music? So I'm kind of in the middle, like I'm neutral in my opinion of AI art because I'm actually in a neutral space. I'm really in the middle of the analog and the digital. I have a high respect for everything and all things analog. For instance, my voice, my talking, my singing. I can sing. I can play with a lot of years of training. I can produce a really nice violin tone. I've mastered the instrument, and then I have a high respect, a very keen interest, and a keen love of the digital space, the complete digital space that is electronic music. I've composed for electronic music. I studied it in Milwaukee when I got my master's. But then now for about 7 to 8 years, I've been working at it, a little bit at a time, frequently, every day, every week, and getting a little bit better as I go. And working in a digital audio workstation like Logic Pro, I'm going to come from a completely neutral position on AI art because I have very high respect for the analog, the digital, the analog digital conversion, one way to the next. I love both worlds. I think both worlds is very important. And I have a high respect for computers. I love computers. I write science fiction and I will have computer characters. Maybe not like Asimov had robotic characters, but it's going to be more or less the same. What does this mean? What does this what does this have to do with AI? We'll talk about music a little bit. It means I think AI, artificial intelligence, the computer language is a very good tool. It's a very nice tool to use for generating sounds and music. SuperCollider is an audio synthesis software, meaning you, through SC language, through a computer language, can output actual sounds, the physics of sounds, involving things like sine tones, frequencies, an amalgamation of all those things, oscillations to control those things to generate sound, and really using the science and mathematics and the psychoacoustics of the world around us in the digital sphere. It has been incredibly flexible. SuperCollider has been incredibly flexible to generate very dynamic sounds, sounds with a lot of motion, sounds that would be very hard for a musician to process in different ways, And then you can work with synths and synthesizers and natural sounds like bird calls and stuff like that. Run it through a synth, run some effects, with different parameters, and then you have this really otherworldly sound. I mean, if you've seen any of my frequency modulation videos or my granular modulation videos, you would hear some pretty interesting sounds, and I still need to work with those. Now, in the academic world where SuperCollider is taught, it is highly encouraged for students or professors probably to, you know, build a SuperCollider score, like a composer would write out a score for the orchestra to play. To build a huge comprehensive SuperCollider score, synced up with all these sorts of blocks of codes to do an order of events, an order of musical events, or an order of sound events. And so the professor would probably, with teaching SuperCollider, the professor would probably encourage the student to build a composition piece involving SuperCollider exclusively, meaning what you put in, that's your piece, no matter what. Now, that can be done, and it can be done quite successfully. But with my experience in SuperCollider, I use it in a more indeterministic way. SuperCollider says, okay, I'm going to output in a sequence 5 notes. And then I could say, SuperCollider, I want you only to play an instance of a quarter of a second. So have a note play every quarter of a second, or an eighth of a second. and said, okay, you want that fixed and you want that equidistant from each other. So it sounds really, boop, 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 systematic like that. Okay, SuperCollider, I actually want you to play an eighth note here, a triplet here, and I'm going to put in certain weights and values. So you play an eighth note 80% of the time, and you play a triplet 20% of the time. Oh, maybe I'll add another note value for 5% of the time or something like that. And SuperCollider will say, okay, you want these 5 notes, you want this note quality 80% of the time, you want this note quality 15% of the time, and then this note, very short note quality 5% of the time. So SuperCollider basically says, okay, these are the parameters you want me to work with, but my output is going to be decided whatever I decide. That's kind of what I've been using SuperCollider for. That's a very basic example, but I use it in a more indeterministic way. I have noticed that writing full-on melodies in SuperCollider is fun, and I even have an old video of it, and it's pretty popular, and I don't know why. It's like one of my older tutorial videos, but I say how to compose a melody in SuperCollider, and it's very hard to compose a melody in SuperCollider because you've got this real big system of a very simple function. That's the thing with computers is sometimes you'll have a huge block of code for a very specific small little gesture. That's why I like to work in indeterminacy or random chance to get something like, oh, I like what SuperCollider did there. And I don't like what SuperCollider did there. And I'll record it, and then I'll keep what I like, and I'll chuck what I don't like. That's the function, because it's like, well, if I have a good melody to compose, I'm just going to either write it on a piece of paper, or I'm just going to plug it in Logic in a sequence of MIDI notes, because that's going to take like 15 seconds. If it's a short enough melody, if I know exactly what I'm doing, give me a minute, I'll flesh out a melody in 1 minute. To actually build a substantial melody in SuperCollider, from a musician's perspective, can take hours because of the system. So it's like, well, okay, I want to use SuperCollider in a more expedient way, like whatever output I can get that I like in the fastest way possible, using the shortest amount of code. That's not always the case, believe me. But again, this is where AI I think would come in, is that, okay, maybe the artist, visual or not, for me, I'm a composer and a musician. Okay, put in these given parameters, see what outputs. If you like it, work with it. If you don't, chuck it and modify it and work with it. I did one melody. It's on Spotify. It's called Sheer, and that was when I used a melody in SuperCollider. I used a lot of that melody that SuperCollider outputted, but then I'm like, you know what? I need an actual traditional melody, and so I'm like, okay, I wanted to use a SuperCollider exclusively for melody, and I end up not liking it. I'm like, okay, SuperCollider, your melodies could be put, in minute 1, minute 2, minute 1 through 3. I'm gonna have a main melody for minute 4 through 7, and then you can do the end of it and stuff like that. And that was my deciding as an artist. So that's where AI, at least to me, comes in very handy, where I use it as a tool. As I said before with the visual artists, I use it as a tool and as a point of reference, but I don't use it exclusively for something I could do much faster, much more intuitively, like writing a melody. I've done harmonies in SuperCollider, and it would take hours just to line it up. And sometimes, the tempo clock, or the way it syncs, the way the SuperCollider syncs up every instance, is very monotonous at times. I'm like, you know what? Let me just plug in some chords in Logic Pro. By the way, I really wanted to make that work. I wanted to make that work where I could play harmonies in SuperCollider and then play like my violin over it or something like that. It's there. It can be done, but it's like, I just would rather work with Logic for that. So real quick on the historical context, when it comes to music, systematic writing and AI writing, having a system and then having an output has been the thing in music history for almost 100 years, if not 100 years now. Yeah, we're in the 2020s. Composers since World War One and a little bit before actually generated systems saying, okay, I've got these rows of notes. I've got the retrograde. I've got the inversion of these notes. I have this system, and whatever's in this system is going to be outputted, and that's going to be my music piece. So composers in the 1920s and 30s, they were really exploring building systems, whether mathematical or otherwise. They were very much interested in exploring building systems and then having that be the output, meaning they were relinquishing artistic control as a composer. Now, I would say for experimental reasons, that's okay to explore, but that can't be the end all be all. It was very much finalized getting into computer music of the 1950s and 60s, but before then with orchestra music and piano music, it was finalized around the mid 1950s and 60s, maybe even the 70s, when Pierre Boulez, for instance, decided, hey, I have a system. I have this grid. I have these notes. I have a grid for pitches. I have a grid for note values between, whole notes and 30-second notes. I have a grid for dynamics. I have a grid for volume, for instance. I have when to play soft, when to play loud. I have when to play these notes. And he would have a completely serialized bit of composition. Now, in its time historically, that is significant. But the problem is when you have a completely systematized thing for your composition, a completely mathematical, non-intuitive, non-expressive, that could be subjective. Let's just say non-intuitive, like a human being wouldn't otherwise come up with this output. When you have that, when it's completely systematized, it becomes random. It starts to sound random. Now, people in the academic space might ask, maybe a student would ask me, like, well, what's wrong with it being random? Well, the thing is, by our ears, for our own survival and our own way of working out in our physical space and environment, we are very selective with our hearing. We tune into a sound that is coming our way very fast or very loud or very high. We're very much aware of bird calls. We're very much aware of footsteps walking behind us. Is that a person we know? Is that our child behind us, running behind us? Is that someone else? Am I about to be attacked? We're very selective with our psychoacoustics and localization, how sounds are being processed into our brain. With randomness, with random output, everything is completely equal. And what that means is when everything is completely equal in importance, everything sounds the same. Now, people might say, hey, wait a sec. 200 hertz sounds very different from 800 hertz. But if you give them equal meaning, they are effectively the same to the human ear and to the human brain. And so when things become systematized, when everything is equal in number, in duration, in value, when everything is completely systematized and equal in value in music, it all sounds the same because we can't associate meaning. We can't associate meaning. What's the trajectory between 200 hertz and 800 hertz? Now, if you have some motion, if you have some trajectory, if you go boo like that, hopefully I didn't hurt your ears that way. If you have that line, okay, that's meaningful. I know there's a bit of ascending going on between pitches. But if you have like this is what college students compose, guys. Remember that. If you have that, whether it's generated on a computer or generated on a piano, it's going to sound the same because it's meaningless to us. People might argue that's subjective, Michelle, or Sound Engraver. But what I'm saying is things that are systematized and outputted without any control of the artist, without any control of how the composer feels about that music, it starts to become meaningless. Now, these systems were done as early as World War I and getting into the 1920s. Especially the 1920s, getting into the 1930s, and especially finalized really with figures like Pierre Boulez and people getting into computer music and all of that. So what I would say is AI generation has actually been in effect for 100 years as far as music is concerned. It's just man-made generation. It's man-made systems with output that is beyond our control. Well, people say, wait a second, you just said man-made systems, so they made the systems. It's like, yeah, but like they're not going to know what it sounds like until the output of those systems. How do I know? I've done it as a student. I've heard it from a professor, from a historical composer figure, and then also working in SuperCollider. It's very much the same practice if you let it in something like SuperCollider. So that's what I just wanted to end on that with the historical context. Again, I love AI in the way of SuperCollider, that SuperCollider is used as a tool to generate sounds I would not have otherwise generated, and also used sounds that I think SuperCollider is going to produce, and say, oh, I like that. I don't really like that. Like I can build a reverb, for instance, and I'm like, okay, SuperCollider, I want this reverb. I want this 3-second long decay effect, this reverb, this echo effect. I want you to have 20 iterations of this kind of space and then detune it on either side of the ear. And then I want you to have a nice gradual decay, maybe after 10 seconds or something. I would know what that would sound like a little bit, but not perfectly. I need SuperCollider as that reference, like, oh, I don't like that reverb. I need to change it. I don't like how it's reverberating with my violin input. I need to change it. So anyway, again, those are tangible examples. I think AI is really good for points of reference. And I would say I would always caution against too much AI input, only because it could, maybe not, but it could actually have you lose your signature, your personality, your own personal artistic signature.